Okay. I had that we were going to go through page 86 in our book, but actually I took it on down to 87. I'm not sure how this chapter is going to work out because there's a long section in there on his suffering, and we may have to break that up in two. But anyway, it's probably going to take us 3 lessons to get through chapter 7. Concerning his suffering, we all have read extensively about the suffering of Christ as he went through the trials, the trial of with the Jews, and then finally the crucifixion and his death, and all the pain and suffering that he went through. And we're going to be studying a little bit about that this evening. So as a way of introduction, there was a fact, it was prophesied and it was stated that the Messiah was going to have to suffer. And when we talk about this suffering, we're going to see some of the aspects of what he went through. We'll also see that he was forsaken by his disciples in Zechariah 13 and verse 7. We're going to look at how he was accused by false witnesses and how he was silent before his accusers and how he was wounded and bruised and what that means. So when you look at Zechariah chapter 13, I thought maybe it might be beneficial for us to kind of understand a little bit about what that chapter talks about. When we look in Zechariah 13, we see in verse 1 that a fountain is open for sin. And before I even get into this is going to be another one of those chapters. In fact, Zechariah is considered a book of Messianic prophecies. But also some of the statements that Zechariah makes is dual nature, as we've talked about so much in the past. And this is another one of those chapters in which we will see that. In verse 1, we see that a fountain is open for sin, the cleansing provided for the house of David in Jerusalem. In David's time, we will see the removal of idolatry and false prophecy, verses 2 through 6. The idols are cut off from the land, false prophets exposed and ashamed, and deception is no longer tolerated. In verse 7, we see the shepherd struck, the shepherd smitten, God's shepherd is smitten, the sheep are scattered. And we see that fulfilled in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 26 and 27. Judgment and refinement, verses 8 and 9. We see that 2/3 of the nation is cut off, whereas 1/3 is refined like gold and silver. They're purified and made perfect. And then we see the restoration of the covenant relationship where the people will say, the Lord is my God. So that's basically what Zechariah 13 encompasses. So when we look in verse 1, in the day that it was spoken about the restored remnant after Babylonian captivity, promise of spiritual cleansing in Jerusalem, the renewal of the covenant faithfulness between the Jews and God after the idolatry has been removed from the land, and it anticipates a purified community under God's rule. So basically what we're looking at is that when they're restored from captivity, the life that they lived, or at least their forefathers lived in idolatry and unfaithfulness, will no longer be that way, but they will be more in tune to God and trying to keep his laws. And we see this begin to be fulfilled in Christ. The fountain ultimately fulfilled in the cleansing blood of Christ as it flowed upon the cross of Calvary. We see access through obedient faith, and we see a permanent and spiritual cleansing rather than a ceremonial purification like the Jews did under the law of Moses. So we kind of see the dual nature of verse 1. 2 through 6, in Zechariah's day, God promises to purge the remaining idolatry and its influence in the land. False prophets will be exposed, rejected, restoration, the purity of doctrine among God's people. We see that fulfilled in Christ. Christ's coming exposes the false religion. And when I say false religion, the Jews claim to be followers of the law of Moses, but they had their own traditions that they said were just as binding to the Jews as the law of Moses was. And if you didn't do their traditions, then you violated the law of Moses. Kind of a strange thing there, but they exposes the false religion of the Jews, and as we get into the New Testament times, we see where the idolatry of the Gentiles was also exposed. We see it displaces idols. The new covenant brings the truth through the Spirit and the teaching of the gospel. And true worship replaces the deception that the Jews placed upon the people, or as the Gentiles in their idolatry. So in verse 7, the shepherd is struck, and Isaiah day could initially reflect upon the judgment upon Israel's leadership. A warning that even appointed leaders may face divine discipline, and scattering follows failure to judge leadership. So we see the scattering possibly in the people as the, like I said, the leadership failed the Jewish people. In the day of Christ, you see that Christ directly makes this application to himself in Matthew 26:31. We see that Christ is struck at his arrest and his crucifixion. His disciples scatter in fear, and yet striking accomplishes the redemption that we read about at the end of the 13th chapter. So the remnant was refined. In Zechariah day, severe judgment purifies the nation. Only a remnant survives the return to their land, and the refining imagery echoes exile and then restoration. Fulfilled in Christ at the cross, judgment falls, ultimately climaxing in AD 70 when Jerusalem is destroyed. Faithful remnant responds to the gospel, and Christians are refined through trials, as we see in 1 Peter chapter 1. And then we have a covenant relationship renewed, and Christ said, "It is my people." Now, if you kind of summarize all of this, in Zechariah's time we see national cleansing, removal of idolatry, the shepherd is judged, the remnant is purified. In Christ we see spiritual cleansing from sin, the triumph of gospel, truth. Christ is crucified and the church refined through trials. So we see the dual nature of this particular chapter. So we look at the statements that are made in verse 7 to 13. We know that it applies to Christ, but also it had an application during the time that Zechariah lived. So forsaken by his disciples. In chapter 7 of Zechariah 13, he says, "Awake, O sword, against my shepherd and against the man that is my fellow. The man that is my fellow, says the Lord of hosts. Smite the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered, and I will turn my hand on the little ones." So what is Zechariah saying here in relation to this shepherd? Well, first of all, he says, "Awake, O sword, against my shepherd." There's going to be death is prophesied against the shepherd. Now, as our book says, when he says, "Awake, O sword," he's not saying he's going to be slain by the sword, but rather there's going to be an instrument that's going to be applied to the shepherd that will inflict death upon him. So it's kind of a generic statement saying he dies by the sword, but he could die in a different manner other than just being cut down by a sword. We see the nature of the shepherd. We see one who's willing to lay down his life for his sheep. And we see that the man is my fellow, saith Jehovah. What he's saying is that this shepherd is the very essence of God, is identical to him in purpose and accomplishment of goals. So that is what we see in chapter 7. Smite the shepherd. This points out what was done and was by the determinate counsel and the knowledge of God. So we see that when God said smite the shepherd, he says this is going to happen. This has to happen. Because without the sacrifice of the perfect lamb and the shedding of his blood, we have no redemption of sin. So God said it's going to happen, and I will make it happen. And when the shepherd is smitten, the sheep will scatter. Now, sheep are not independent grazers like cattle. They're kind of goofy in their mind. So they rely heavily upon the shepherd. They listen to his voice. When they hear him, here they come to the shepherd. The shepherd directs them to go a particular direction. That's the way they go. And if something happens, they rely upon the shepherd to take care of them. And without this kind of leadership, the sheep will become scattered. You throw a wolf in there, and they'll just go crazy and just go all over the place. They wouldn't know. They don't know how to come together as a group and fend off the attacker. So in real life shepherding, like I know anything about shepherding, but what I found out was that if a predator attacks and the shepherd is incapacitated, the sheep will panic. They will just scatter. They run in different directions rather than staying together, and they have no instinct to organize or defend themselves. That is not in their nature. So in real life shepherding, scattered sheep are more vulnerable to danger than other types of livestock. He said even today, shepherds use dogs, fences, and constant supervision to make sure that the sheep just don't naturally wander off. And that's the nature of shepherding. So when we look at the statement of Zechariah saying the sheep will scatter, think of it how the shepherd understands his flock, and that's what we are looking at here. So we see this fulfillment in Matthew 26:31. Jesus said, "You will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered." Again, Jesus makes this application to himself. So our book makes a statement, and I got to thinking about that, and I said, what was he actually saying when he says that he suffered all alone, and when he was crucified, he was alone? Or at least he went through all of this and he was alone. And I said, I don't think that's quite the case, because when you see those that were present at the crucifixion, even at the judgment of Christ, we see, Peter tried to get as close as he could to see what was going on. So I think that they may have scattered, but they were still within, a distance of trying to understand what was happening. But when we see at the crucifixion, we see that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was there, Mary Magdalene was there, Mary of Clopas, Salome, identified by comparing Matthew and Mark. And all of these are found in this references in Matthew 27, Mark 15, and John 19. They stood afar off at first, though John indicates that some were near the cross. We see that in John chapter 19. And then we have the Apostle John himself. This is the only apostle specifically mentioned that was present at the crucifixion of Christ. And we know that because he said, "Son, behold your mother, and mother, behold your son." And at that day, John took her into his household. So John was close enough that Jesus could speak to him. So what does this mean that he was all alone? The only thing I could come up with was that, in a sense, he was alone because there was no one there to defend him in the trial or to protect him in his time of need when they were crucifying and even beating him. He had to suffer this alone. No one was there to stand up for him or with him or in any sense try to alleviate what was going to happen, what was happening. So he was not alone as far as persons being there, family and friends, but I think the sense of alone was that they just could not do anything for him. Accused by false witnesses. Now, Psalms 35:11 says, "False witnesses did rise up. They laid to my charge things that I knew not." Now, David had wrote this, and if we consider David's time, we don't know what was going through David's mind when he wrote it. It could be prompted by the many enemies that he had throughout his life. It could be the problems he had with King Saul, or it could be the problems that he had in later years. As we studied in 2 Samuel, that he had problems with his son trying to usurp his throne and all the issues that were involved in that. And either way, we see similar actions in David's life against Jesus as far as false accusations. And I think this is, when you get into thinking about these false accusations, it's kind of interesting how Jesus handles them. He says, "Things I knew not." Now, it's not like, "Oh, I'm surprised, I didn't know anything, but rather it was things that he knew to be true, and the accusations were false. He knew what was going to happen. He knew what they were saying and the accusations they were making. It was nothing new to him. He was charged with crimes he did not commit, and he was accused of matters he had no knowledge of. So or at least admitted to. So many false witnesses came forward, and I think it's kind of interesting. He said, you know, that the Sanhedrin had trouble finding two who would agree. In fact, it just seemed like they were just rolling them in until they finally found two that would agree on what Jesus had said or what would convict him. In fact, two came forward and they said, this man stated, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Now, that's not what Jesus said. That's a false statement. Because what Jesus said was, you destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. So there's a difference between raising something up and building something up. And so that in itself is a false statement. It's kind of like a half-truth, if you want to say it in any other way. But Jesus never once answered any of these accusations. Even when the high priest demanded him to say, are these true? He never said a word. And when Pilate was questioning him about these things, he never said a word. And it's interesting because if someone who has already predetermined that they're going to kill you and they're going to find false witnesses to do it, there's nothing you can do to change their mind. That's basically what it comes down to. And if Jesus would have answered these people and their accusations, what Jesus would have done is just thrown gasoline on the fire. It would just fired everything up and it would just exploded and just make things worse with it. But the fact is that the Jews knew that these were false witnesses. The false witnesses knew that they were lying. And Jesus understood what was going on. And by his silence, he was showing dignity, control of the events, and that they were not doing anything that was going to cause him to lose his cool, so to speak, and fall into the temptation of what they were throwing at him to cause him to sin. But he does answer when the high priest directly asked Jesus if he was the Son of God. Now he answers. All of these other things is not important. But now you ask me the thing that is important. Am I the Son of God? Now he answers. And he told him, he said that you will see that I will sit down on the right hand of power and that they would see him coming in the clouds of heaven. And by this statement, they throw their hands up and say, what else do we have need of for witnesses? He has already condemned himself by blasphemy. So he was telling them what they already knew, and we'll see that in just a moment. But that was the whole point of Jesus speaking, was all of these other things are insignificant because we all know they're lies and they're serving your purpose to kill me. Now I'm going to speak because what I'm going to say is important for your eternal salvation and what you need to do to find yourself right before God. Time to speak, time not to speak. Now in Leviticus 24:16, he says, he that blasphemes the name of the Lord, he shall surely be put to death, and all the congregation shall surely stone him. Now what does blasphemy include? Well, it includes cursing or reviling God's name, speaking presumptuously against God, claiming divine authority, defiant rebellion against God. All of these things fall into the category of blasphemy. Now, the law also had judicial safeguards to protect the individual from certain things, or false accusations or being falsely accused. First of all, there had to be at least 2 or 3 witnesses. There had to be careful examination of testimony. And even the Jews admit this in their Talmud, and the chief priest just basically ignored that requirement. And then we see that the punishment was that the witnesses were to cast the stones first. That did not happen. And we see again the violation of the law, but we see the safeguards. If you make an accusation against a person for blasphemy, you're the one that's going to have to throw the first stone. And that places upon you the great responsibility. At the time of the statement, the Lord's words were misunderstood as applying to Herod's temple. After his crucifixion, we are told that the Jews knew that he predicted that he would rise from the dead after 3 days. Matthew 27, 62 and 63. So at some point they actually came to an understanding of what Jesus was actually talking about. In fact, Matthew says the next day, following the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees came together to Pilate, saying, "Sir, we remember that the deceiver had said that while he was yet alive, after 3 days I will rise again." So they knew before all this was happening what Jesus was talking about. And now they were fearful that it could come true. So we see not only there, but Isaiah 53 tells us that Jesus was going to suffer. And there's 10 or 12 things that Isaiah points out to us. First of all, he comes in lowliness. He is despised and rejected of men. He suffered for the sins in the place of others. It was God himself who caused the suffering to be vicarious. It was to be absolute resignation of the vicarious suffering, and he was to die as a felon. He was to be cut off prematurely. He was personally guiltless. He was to live on after his sufferings. And it was God's pleasure was then to prosper in his hand. And he was to enter into mighty triumph after his suffering. And by this, and by justifying man through his death and living again, he was to see the travail of his soul and satisfied. So he was going to go through all of this and understand that by justifying man through the shedding of his blood and our coming in contact with that blood, then the travail of his soul, what he had to go through, would be satisfactory to him, because he would understand that everything I went through was for the benefit of men. Done before his accusers. It says, yet he opened not his mouth. Now, the voluntary nature of suffering he was to endure. He was oppressed, probably referring to the payment for the penalty of sins of man. His suffering would be borne patiently. There would be no threats coming forth from him during all of this. No abuse and no reviling would be heard from the suffering Messiah. He was oppressed through all of these things, but yet he would not find himself bringing accusations against those who were accusing him, or bringing threats from him for retribution. And in fulfillment of that, we see that when he was accused of the chief priest, he answered nothing. Pilate said to him, hear you not how many things they witnessed against you? And he answered him to never a word, so that the governor was greatly marveled greatly. So even to Pilate, who was the man that could turn Jesus loose, he would not answer the accusation of the false witnesses. To him, to Jesus, that was not what was important. What was important was the salvation of man before God. Even to Pilate, he would not give an answer. So why this silence? First of all, Jesus' silence was not a sign of weakness. I think it was deliberate fulfillment of the prophecy that he was the Messiah. When accusations are knowingly false and the court is corrupt, a defense would not change the outcome. Jesus had already testified to truth earlier. There was nothing further to add. These Jews had listened to Jesus the 3 years that he preached. There was nothing more that he could add that would change their minds about what they were doing. And he was not silent about the truth, only about the slander. So Jesus' sacrifice was intentional, but it was not forced. Think that the Jews forced him to be crucified. It was not, because he willingly gave himself in this situation. Jesus modeled to us how we should endure unjust sufferings through sinful retaliation, without the sinful retaliation. His silence actually testified louder than words. And by his silence, he showed that he was dignified in this situation, that it was innocence, and that he even had the authority even in submission. And I think that just speaks volumes in itself. Like I said earlier, why argue with a stump, so to speak? Because they were not going to listen to him. They knew what they were going to do and why they were going to do it. It was going to happen one way or the other. So he stood there in dignity and innocence and with the authority of the Son of God. So even as Peter said that when he was reviled, he reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judges righteously. What he did because it was God's plan for the salvation of man, and he committed himself to do that. Wounded and bruised. He was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities, the chastisement of our peace was on him, and with his stripes we are healed. Now, of wounded, we know that his hands and his feet were nailed through to the cross. We knew that his side was pierced with a spear. He was indeed wounded, and he was bruised. Now, this could be caused by the beatings he had, but I think also we have to look at the inward conflict, or at least the inward effect that it had upon him. We know that in the Garden of Gethsemane, he cried, just horribly, that he did not want to go through this, but he was going to do God's will. And he even said, if it's possible, take this away from me, but not what I want, what you will, I will go through. So he was bruised. I think it was a crushing attitude of heart, as well as the outward suffering. In the stripes, he was scourged, he suffered as he was whipped. And we need to make note of this. Now, I'm trying to think, I think our author in our book went through some of this, but we should note that it was the Romans that had Jesus scourged. Pilate said that, Jesus was innocent, he needs to be, I don't find anything wrong with this man. And the Jews forced his hand, and so Pilate said, scourge the man and let him be crucified. So the scourging, as well as the crucifixion, came at the hands of the Romans. And that's interesting because the Jews were bound by the law of Moses that a person could not be whipped more than 40 times. But under the Roman law at that time, the whipping did not stop until the commander said it was enough. So you could go as many as 100 lashes. And if he still said give him another 20 more, they went 20 more times. The commander had control over that situation. And we have to understand that this punishment was not for his sins, but it was for the sins of all mankind. We see that fulfillment. They released Barabbas, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. That's what Pilate did. So Pilate repeatedly stated that he found no fault in Jesus and was really intent on having him released. But it was political pressure from the Jews that he consented. And when you think about it, the Jews had enough, I think, authority and enough push in the Roman political system that if Pilate had to face the accusation of these Jews, it could cost him his position in the face of the Roman government, and even before Caesar, that he probably could lose his job, he probably could even lose his life if they took it to certain extremes. But they told him, and the Jews cried out, saying, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. Jesus said he was king of the Jews, or at least he says, I am the Messiah, I am the king. They understood that he's the king. And they were playing on Pilate and said, if you let this man go who claims himself to be a king, who is in opposition to Caesar, you're not his friend, and you can grant you Caesar is going to take out his judgment upon you. So Pilate found himself between the rock and the hard spot. And so to him, he was probably thinking, Jesus is just another man and put these Jews to rest, and I won't have to worry about it anymore after this. So he said, beat him, crucify him. Let this get this situation out of my court. So in the fulfillment, we see that it is inconceivable that the hatred that the Jews showed toward God had grown so strong that they had wanted to kill him. You think about that. They hated Jesus, the Son of God. They knew that he was the Messiah, or at least claiming to be the Messiah. They knew the miracles that he had done. They knew everything about this man. And they hated him so much that they wanted to kill him. And if he was indeed the Son of God, their hatred was directed at God himself. And when you think about that hatred, Why would they do that? Well, it's just like any other politician today that we see in our country and the countries in other world. They will do whatever it takes to stay in power, to maintain and gain their wealth and control that they have over people. And they will do this unhindered by anyone or by God. And I think that was what was driving these Jews. They saw Jesus as a instrument of removing them from their position, and they did not like that. And then we see that to express love for such people shows the outstanding glory of God. Think about that. These people were just rotten to the core towards the Messiah and towards God, and yet God still loved his creation enough to say that I am willing to die for you. That shows us the outstanding love and glory of God. So what do we see in all this? We should show the same dignity as Christ against false accusations. Even when our closest friends forsake us, Christ will not forsake us. We should not be tempted and ensnared in bouts of anger or accusations. And we may be falsely judged by men, but God's judgment will always be righteous. And that's what we need to remember. We may suffer for wrong that is not our doing, but we have to understand that God will stand with those that are righteous. And when that day comes and we have to stand before him in the day of judgment, he will remember what was done against his children, and he will execute his judgment in a righteous manner. Questions or comments? Kind of went through a whole lot, but I think it's important to understand that there were some things in prophecy that Jesus had no control over as far as making these things happen. And if there's some things in prophecy that he had control over, why would he allow himself to be tortured and punished and put to death just to fulfill a prophecy? You know, that's one of the, I think, grand things about prophetic statements in the Old Testament of this nature.
So the author said about Jesus being alone. How do you explain that with being on the cross and being forsaken by God, as he says?
Well, God turned himself away from the sacrifice for sin. He would not look upon the sin that he was bearing. And I would think too that at that particular time, when God did turn his face from Christ, when those sins were being offered up as a sacrifice, and he said, "Why have you forsaken me?" You know, I think if there was any time in his life that he could have sinned or not fulfilled his mission, was probably at that time, because that was the first time in his life that I think that he experienced what mankind experiences. And that is living a life and God has turned away from you. And when we say that he was tempted in all points like as we, I think this was probably the most awakening point in his life. He knew these things happen, but to experience living without God and God turning his face against you, that was the ultimate fear that I think that he felt during this whole ordeal. Why have you turned? Why have you forsaken me? I'm doing everything you want. Why have you forsaken me? And I think we should understand that living a life without God is a life that we may think is wonderful, but the reality of it is that we are forsaken by God.
Did you say the sword could be like Judas? Since it used he was the one that kind of betrayed him, so he turned it into the big one.
Zechariah's use of the word "O sword," I think it would be any type of instrument that would be used to cause the death of the shepherd. And we could look at the instrument of the cross as being the sword, but at the same time, it could be the people involved with the whole scenario of him leading up to that particular point. So yes, people could be just considered a sword also. You know, like Jesus said, the tongue is sharper than a two-edged sword. So, you know, our tongue can cut even to a man's. What was I thinking? I lost my thought. Anyway, I hear the thumping because my battery's going down, and I'm hearing hammering now on top of my roof. Anyway, we'll pick up, we'll go through pages 89. I tell you what, read through the chapter, because at some point I'm going to have to make a decision where to really split these next two lessons up. Thank you for your time and your attention.